welcome. Thank you. Good afternoon. Hello. Can you all hear me? This is empowering to speak in a church. This is fun. I've brought you all here because I have something to say. Welcome and thank you for bearing with us at this City Club and our location change. So this is a very lovely location. The very operational sound system. It's nice. Sponsors today and all this season of City Club, let me read those for you. In the gold category, we have Larson Motors, Chemeketa Community College, Western Title and Escrow, McMinnville Area Chamber of Commerce, Columbia Bank, On Point Community Credit Union, First Federal Savings, Gormley Plumbing and Mechanical, and Cellar Ridge Construction. In the silver category, we have First American Title, Payne West Insurance, Hillside Retirement Communities, The News Register, Sokol Blosser Winery, Willamette West Realtors, and in the Cultural Trust, we have Stephen Rupp, Phil and Phoebe Newman, Jeb and Michelle Bladine, Dan and Mary Corrigan, and Richard Ulrich. Yes, thank you, sponsors. Our remaining schedule of programs is right off the top of my head. Only 2 left, and just got bad news. Next month was going to be Maria Stewart giving sort of a history of the International Pinot Noir celebration here at its 30th year anniversary, but she has some family issues, and so she will not be speaking next month to us. We will be coming up with a filler program, so stay tuned for that. But we will have in June Charles K. Johnson and John Howison talking on Hanford and the most contaminated site in America, which will be very interesting. The June pub chat we have scheduled, so our June pub chat's coming up, and it is appropriately regarding the solar eclipse. The talk is called There Goes the Sun. OSU professor's coming up to drink beer and share his knowledge and cool stories about solar eclipse. And we'll stay in front of you on that, but it's Tuesday, June 20th, so you'll want to make sure you attend that so you can impress all your friends about the solar eclipse. But today we have a Linfield professor, and he's a professor of poetry and other various writing, I'm sure. And he's actually probably best known for being my neighbor. Yeah, I know. It's a star-studded cast here. But he's also, right now, kind of a good timing. He's up for Oregon Book Award. Up for, or have you won? Up for Oregon Book Award. And he has some selection of books in the back. So make sure you check those out on the back table and pick one up on your way home. And I believe it's National Poetry Month as well. We're in National Poetry Month, so we're checking all our civic duty boxes here. And without further ado or bad jokes, I will bring up Joe Wilkins.
Thanks, Zach, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. This is really wonderful to get to do, to address your community and to talk about things that matter to you. So I'm grateful to the City Club for hosting this series. So we're new to McMinnville, my wife and I. Liz, she's here today too. So, and we have 2 young children. We moved here 3 years ago, and we moved here from a small town in North Iowa. And before that, we'd been in rural Idaho, and before that, rural Mississippi, where we both taught in the public schools. And we were just out of college then, just out of Gonzaga University, which is where Liz and I met. And before Spokane, before all this moving around, I lived the first 19 years of my life in the same farmhouse, a drafty, oddly seamed thing that had long ago been stitched together from the husks of abandoned homesteaders' shacks. I lived the first 19 years of my life on a sheep and hay ranch in the far reaches of eastern Montana, on a ranch 6 miles west of an outpost town that was itself 80 miles from anywhere, way out on the vast high desert country known as the Big Dry. I often meet people who have visited Montana. They tell me how beautiful it is. I nod, but I know they're thinking of Glacier National Park, of the ski lodges around Bozeman, of Brad Pitt fly fishing the Big Blackfoot, as he did in the movie version, of the great Montana novel A River Runs Through It. The Montana I knew as a boy was a long way from those majestic mountain peaks and anything resembling Brad Pitt. The Montana I knew was hard and dry, the creeks slicking to dust in June, the badlands and ridges wind-warped and tortuous, the prairie pocked with cactus, alkali, and rattlesnakes. Yet I loved nothing more as a boy than stuffing my slingshot in my back pocket and taking off for the hills, wandering beneath that big dry sky. The land was hard, but in its way beautiful. And my mother and my grandfather taught me to appreciate that beauty, though they seldom used that word. Rather, they taught me with their attention. Say my grandfather stopping to listen to the first meadowlark of the morning. Say my mother bending down to study a cactus flower. There was beauty to be had in that far place, but there was also, sadly, much that was unbeautiful, that was downright ugly. There were deep strip mines in the Bull Mountains. Flying over Montana just a few years ago, I could see those strip mines from the plane. You can see the scars around Colstrip and farther west towards Roundup. There were pesticides and unsafe levels of fertilizer in the rivers, the detritus of intensive oil drilling scattered all about. The first time I ran across my hometown's name in anything besides our local paper was in the book Badland by the journalist Jonathan Rabin. He was writing about places a little further east of my hometown of Melstone, but he also drove the entire train line that the town he was writing about was on towards Seattle. So he drove the train line and so ended up in Melstone. And this is what he had to say about the place I grew up. A forlorn grid of dirt streets and moldering shacks. When they could afford it, Melstone families had deserted the shacks and moved into trailers in their yards. Junked automobiles stood where they had stopped in the 50s and 60s. Bereft of glass and every salvageable moving part, their rusted shells had come to look like the Melstone version of civic sculpture. Melstone appeared to have fallen clean through the net of white North America. It would not have been out of place in Senegal or Guinea-Bissau, this sorry accumulation of makeshift shelters, scrap metal, and mud. That was home. Beyond the land itself, at least what land that had not been plowed to death, grazed to dust, or salted with the runoff of one extractive industry or another, there was little that was beautiful about the place I grew up. And the culture of that place celebrated that lack. Beauty was looked on by too many as frivolous and dainty, as antithetical to survival, which is, of course, one of the primary reasons that the place I come from is dying. It is hard to get the news from poetry, William Carlos Williams famously wrote, yet every day men die miserably for lack of what is found there. I left eastern Montana in search of something beautiful. Young people continue to do the same. When I graduated 20 years ago, there were more than 40 of us in grades 9 through 12 at Melstone Public High School. Today, less than 20 are enrolled. Farms continue to be foreclosed on and sold. A few businesses in town close their doors. While there are all sorts of forces at work here, it seems plain as day to me that a community that does not reckon with beauty will coarsen and weaken and finally blow away like so much dust. And this is happening all across the country in too many rural communities. And there are political and economic needs that must be met. That's for sure. Yet a small community determined not just to survive, but to thrive, must also ask itself different questions. Municipal leaders, business people, and professionals must ask not only is it necessary, or will it work, or is it economical, they must also ask, and take these answers as seriously as all the rest, is it beautiful? Will it bring beauty into people's lives? How many people's lives? A community determined to thrive might tell itself a very different story. Rather than rehash all the old bland myths of individualism and efficiency, this community might encourage the local and the peculiar, for as we know, beauty is found always in the particular. It might invest in not just functional but beautiful public spaces, in lovely parks and street lamps and trails and schools. It might, as the great old American poet did and would have us do, celebrate and sing itself with parades and festivals and all manner of reasons to gather. I hope this is beginning to sound like a community you all know. I do think we have that community, though of course to keep it and grow it for ourselves and for our children, we must continue to ask those questions, take the answers seriously, to tell the stories, to value beauty. And what does poetry have to do with any of this? That's why I'm here. I'm a poet. Like all the arts, which are just as necessary, poetry asks us to pay attention. And attention, of course, is the beginning of noticing and appreciating, and so cultivating what is beautiful. To read a poem is to train and challenge one's notion of beauty. To share a poem is to call someone's attention back to the beautifully multitudinous world. To try your own hand at writing a poem is to engage the rigors and reckonings of what is true and beautiful. Because of the place I grew up, and the places I've lived, many of them rural, much of my own work as a poet has been in the realm of reclamation, in salvage. In places we might not look for beauty, I tried to find it. And I'd like to continue, before question and answers or discussion here, to read some poems. It's National Poetry Month, and it's what I do, so I'm going to read some poems, and hopefully they have a little bit to do with what I've said here. So I'm going to read one from each of my books, and the first one is a poem called How to Bring Down Rain, and it begins in the sense of, I grew up in this country that was so dry. I mean, most years we got less than 12 inches of rain a year. It's called a big dry. Well, it was named by Meriwether Lewis. As they were coming through, they're coming across on the Missouri, and he writes in his journals, "We came across the most interesting river today. It is as wide as the Missouri is at this point and contains not a single drop of flowing water." So it was this huge river channel that cuts across this big swath of country, but there's no year-round rivers in the entire place. It's all dries up by May or June. And so this came out of the thinking, okay, I grew up in this dry place. How might I bring the rain down onto it? How might I do that? And so that's what I'm attempting to do in words in this poem. How to bring down rain. First, listen to the old men. Watch their dry lips flap. Throw sheep bones in the river, ribs and unlinked wings of spine. See the water wet them. It's possible. Shoulder the sun and walk the fence line west. Wipe an oily head of sweat on your t-shirt. Now come in for lunch. Tomato sandwich, ice water, the easy chair in the cellar where you open all your father's books, breathe their inky dust. Then dream him an old man. Dream him dead again, years later, when fathers should die. Chase your sister with a broken mouse. Tell your brother lies about the neighbor girl. Though there's no water anymore, crack off the ram's skull, toss it in the river too. See the gravel, smooth as skin, and your mother's face like gravel. Look at her. No, God does not hate you. The 9 years of drought is child's play. Now come back to the old men. See them rise from wooden chairs, hear their bones sift the dust of yesterday's rain. So I grew up on a sheep farm, and so once a year, we would get together with all the other neighbors who ran sheep in the area, and you would call in a sheep shearing outfit to shear all your sheep. And because it was so natural for me as a boy, it was like Christmas, sheep shearing. It just came every year. That's just what happened. I never thought of it as particularly interesting or strange. And then, of course, I went off to college, and people looked at me like I was, things were growing out of my ears when I would talk about this. You're like, what? And then when I could see it through their eyes, I thought, oh my, that is a strange thing, isn't it? They would roll in with these kind of like semis, and they would be, you'd back them up to the corrals, and the sheep would be herded up into there, and that's where they did all the shearing, was in this really long structure. And then they'd have this sort of trap doors that they'd sort of roll the sheep out one side and roll the wool out the other side. And then there was all the attendant work that had to be done, herding the sheep back into another corral and then stuffing all the wool into a big sack. And the sheep shearers themselves, they did this for their livelihood, so they would, they'd start in about now, April, and they'd shear all through August or September. And so they had no permanent home or place. They were mostly itinerant. And they would, the ones that were high up, the sheep shearing muckety mucks, they would travel in Airstream trailers. And the ones who weren't just had old pickups, And they would show up, and many of them had families, and these their wives would come and their kids would come. And so it would take, for all of us neighbors together, it would take about 3 or 4 days, and it was sort of like this crazy circus came to town when it was sheep shearing. Everyone stayed out of school. And so anyway, this is called the Sheep Shearers, and it's loosely a sonnet sequence. And I've got a Wikipedia entry for an epigraph, which I remember when I was thinking about this, I was like, oh man, that was weird. I wonder if it's, if I can Google it and find anything, see anything. And Wikipedia came up, and the first line was, a distinct culture has evolved out of the practice of shearing sheep. So, the Sheep Shearers. All long necks and whiskers and 3-day hangovers sweated out on the peeling linoleum of some low-slung camper. All greasy jeans and pearl snap shirts undone to the belly. All black coffee and cigarettes and potted meat. No one respectable, that's for sure. Though come April, it wasn't about respectable. From behind the old sofa, you watched Johnny Ahern sprawl in a chair at the kitchen table, wet trail of snooze dripping from his frog's chin. Your mother fed him 3 kinds of pie. Your father shook his gnarled hand that could take a sheep to skin in seconds, and said, thanks for coming, Johnny. Lord and the devil know we need you. Skinny as a barn cat, the one that knocked on the door and came in for chamomile tea and a visit with your mother. Her face was square and small, a ribbon of scar from ear to chin. And after her small cup, she rolled a cigarette, tapped the ash into her palm. She was one of those that could have been 23 or 42. No matter. What you remember most is how her straw hair was pulled back with flowers. It was yet midwinter. She must have grown them in whichever rusted airstream she called home, carried them in her lap through 1,000 icy miles of mountain two-lane, set them in the sink after the table was broke down into a marriage bed. And now, wringing her wrecked face, umber buds, filigree of leaf, a crown of wild rose. Milk-faced and bare-chested, trousers gone to threads, they stood in a ragged line and stared at you. You stared back. They didn't speak but turned and ran to the river, so you followed, picked up a rock like they did and winged it at a carp. Together you floated a hunk of cottonwood to the far bank, set a muskrat trap, jostled and laughed, and when the sheep were sheared, the men gone into town for liquor, women gathering dogs and laundry, you sat on the steps and worked river mud from between your toes, felt with each breath the bluing bruise on your chest, where after she threw you to the ground, that dark-eyed shearer's girl propped a knee to pin you and kissed you hard on the mouth. So last poem, but it's the longest, so get comfortable. When we lived in Iowa, we lived in a very small town, about 4,000 people. And the big event of the year was the garage sale days spelled with a Z, yeah. And a special edition of the paper came out, and people had all their stuff in there. And one year, the garage sale days happened to coincide with the fact that we were expecting our first child in July, and so this was in May. And so this poem is called The Garage Sale Days Meditations, and it sort of charts those things coming together. 1. Look at them, slumped in a corner there, ears pounded and mouse-bitten, ragged legs askew, rubber lips kissing cold cement. Even here, among the abandoned, they're twice forsaken. The coffee cup, chipped to a wobble, is ever at hand. The faded sweater desires shoulders, sure, but a hanger anyway does the trick. Even that flattened football fairly whistles with tossed potential. What is it that goes out of dolls? They have never been more than what they are. How is it they now look less? Don't look, says the mother. Left arm crooked and loaded with a dozen pairs of slacks. Honey, if they scare you, just look the other way. Her little girl knows already we're only going the one way. And so takes the measure of these one-eyed, earless, hacked-balled dolls. Takes a step closer, her own rubber soles kissing cold cement. On every one, she's put a price tag. Oh, sure, as old alphabet blocks go, they're good. This clown's lips still strawberry, each tree green and tall. But why is S 20 cents? And why, Q, are you a dime less demanding? Or Mr. Victory, upright V, with your violet ink and predictable violin, why do you deserve not just a dime, but a dozen cents? It doesn't make any sense. Though maybe her first husband was a Leon or a Larry, and that's why L is had now for the linty nickel at the bottom of my pocket. Wayne, it says, on the back of the upright mirror in blue Koran. The woman at the shoebox till, hair crimped and bleached, can't be more than 24. I don't hear a thing from the house. And 2, there are the toys. Yellow dump truck without a wheel, box of just worn baseballs, those few pairs of some small boy's patch-kneed jeans. Where, oh where can he be? God of garage sales, of Jefferson Airplane 8 tracks, of mismatched rose-patterned plates, of shave cream bottles shaped like rocket ships, and stilettos red as sour candy, of 16 neon t-shirts imploring one and all to eat at Jake's, of just $1, 3 for 1, you won't find another, of all things cold from basement closet corners, of all things wearing a decade's furs of dust, of all things justly and unjustly junked. I pray now, here, in this stranger's strange garage, for this one, whose blue name is Wayne. Iowans are easy, all smiles and apologies. But the nicest set of drawers I've found belongs to the Italian down the street. All his 80 years and 98 pounds given to rage. Rage at whatever idiocy the new day brings. Today, I offer 30. His old face fists, his 2 fists like birds shot dead. You think my things are not so nice? You think I sell this good thing I bought in Omaha with my own money? Bought when I was young too, when I was man as you? That's what you think? $32.50, you haul it out yourself. It's gotten darker than I hoped. And so, after fingering for hours the hidden, homely things of these my town's men and women, I'm on my way back home. Before I left, you said, only what's on the list. And because I love you, I promised. Though right off, I think you'll understand these LPs, look here, Little Feat's Dixie Chicken, couldn't be passed up. The Jimmy Carter coffee cup, that may be a stretch, but it was only 50 cents. And for $1, I got this charcoal grill shaped like a can of Pabst. Can you believe it? Just $1. Yes, I found a rocking chair, changing table, swing, and bouncing seat. Yes, now we're ready. Yes, I'm as happy as can be. Yes, yes, life is made of cast-off things. God, yes, we need that yellow pail. It's for him to carry things in, whoever he is, whatever he needs to carry. Thank you. I'm happy to try to field any questions or comments or thoughts. Yeah.
When are we going to have a McMinnville Poetry Slam?
Well, they do a couple of things here. I do think it would be great to have even more coordination between many of them, but the Terroir Creative Writing Festival happens at Chemeketa each spring. I think it's coming up towards the end of April. 22nd, okay, there we are. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful sort of gathering of writers and people interested in writing and reading. At Linfield, we have the readings at the Nick, which are always free and open to the public. About twice an academic term, so 2 in the fall, 2 in the spring. We've got one coming up on Thursday, and then on May 5th, we've got Peter Ho Davies, who's kind of a real luminary, is going to be coming, and we were lucky to nab him on his trip through the West Coast, so he's going to be reading there. And then the other thing they do is the Paper Gardens contest, and there's the adult contest, so people who want to send something in, and then there's also, my favorite part is the kids, and I judged that the other year, and at the gathering they make a book of all the winners, and the young people are so fun to watch as they come up and read their poem or their story. So I think there are some things, so of course it's always about gathering those together and making sure people know and hear.
The library does a monthly?
Oh yes, the library's poetry reading. It's close to monthly, usually the first Thursday, I think. Yeah.
At the tea shop?
It's not at the tea shop
Right.
anymore, it's at the Ten Oaks Gallery.
Oh.
Yeah.
What used to be the video store.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Across the road from Linfield. Yeah. Yeah.
So I just haven't been listening.
Yeah, there are some, but again, it's about making sure we all know about them. Yeah. Yeah.
How and when did you realize that you were not a sheep rancher?
I realized I wasn't a sheep rancher pretty early. I didn't especially love it, and I was also kind of abysmal at it. I wasn't, my grandfather was quite a horseman, and I think I got bucked off every horse I ever tried to ride. So I realized pretty early on, though it also, so my father died when I was young, and my grandfather was pretty heartbroken about it, and when I think I was just about to turn 13, he sort of, without any warning, sold the biggest chunk of our ranch off, which I think a lot of people in the family were a little frustrated about because he hadn't really talked with anybody about it, but I remember being really happy because I wouldn't then have to face this question. It'd be answered for me. And so I went off to college, but I studied engineering in college. I actually graduated with a computer engineering degree because I didn't know being a poet was something you could do, that still existed. I didn't have access to that kind of imagination as a young person. And it was my last year of college when I finally had a little room in my schedule that I took. I'd always loved reading, and I took a poetry writing course, and very, very quickly I realized that something was going on here that mattered to me a lot. And whatever it was, I wanted it as part of my life.
And you can make a living with it, that's even better.
Well, I always tell my students that writing is a part of your life. It's not all your life, and that people do things that support and surround and add value to their lives and their writing. And so I'm a teacher. I teach over at Linfield, and that's, Linfield pays me my check. Poetry doesn't pay the check. But I do think those things go very well together. I love teaching, and I love spending my days surrounded by words and surrounded by young people who are very fascinated by words. And so that very much feeds into what I do as a poet.
What's the difference between poetry, lyrics, and other stuff.
Sure, okay. So poetry and prose, so this is a book of nonfiction, literary journalism, and really the only difference is it goes to the right margin. And in poetry, it gets broken. And people sometimes have other versions of that, but really that's the key distinction, that you have a tool of control as a poet that you don't have as a prose writer, and that is where you break the line. And by breaking the line, you force a reader to stay with a particular series of words or to make connections between words that they might not otherwise make. There's other things poets do, of course, traditional forms or traditional meters or things that sometimes we think of when we think of poetry, but those are kind of ancillary, I think, to the real tool, which is the line break. And you'll find that people do all sorts of things in the margins too. So you'll see in this book, I was hoping I didn't open up to one of them when I was making my point there, but you'll see some prose in here that I'm calling a poem. And so sometimes poets will give up the line, or sometimes prose writers will do some things that look a little bit like poetry. But I think in many ways that's the real difference. Poetry and lyrics often have that lineation, right? And so they're compressed and they're dense, which is definitely a similarity. The key difference there is that as a poet, you're making all the music yourself. And as a lyricist, you are relying on other instruments. You have other tools to use. And so that the words have this other thing behind them, backing them up.
Mainly the rhythm?
The rhythm, the sound of the guitar, the particular timbre of a singer's voice, all of that matters to the way the lyric is interpreted. In literary circles and people on Facebook friends, there was quite an uproar and discussion when Bob Dylan was named the Nobel Prize winner in literature, which I love Bob Dylan. But I do think that many people had a point. Well, he's not really a poet, he's a lyricist. And we have for a long time not thought of lyrics. We give a separate Nobel Prize in music. And so it felt a little bit like they were sort of, crossing the street when they're supposed to be focusing on literature. But I think they're related, just as poetry and prose are related, but there are differences.
Did you agree that Bob Dylan was a stretch?
Yeah, he's a stretch, but I really like him, so I wasn't worked up. I just saw, but some people were very worked up. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your process for writing a poem and developing?
Yeah. So there's this great Seamus Heaney poem called "Digging." If you've never read it or heard it, you can go onto YouTube and just write Heaney, Heaney, digging, and you'll find like 17 videos of it. He's, again, a Nobel Prize winner, very famous. And he's from Ireland, so he's got this wonderful Irish accent that you could just listen to forever. But the poem "Digging" is all about watching his father and his grandfather dig for potatoes and dig sod. By God, the old man could handle a spade, he says, one of the lines. And it's this great poem about, and it's really earthy and full of the movement and the sounds of digging. And then the last lines he says, "But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it." And so it becomes this ars poetica, this sense of it's work, and I think of it as work. And so a lot of times a poem begins in an image or something I hear or see. It begins in maybe a question I have, and I toy around with that with pencil and paper for a while, and then eventually turn to the screen and start seeing what might happen. And it takes lots of drafts. There are poems in this latest book that were sort of in their final form in a couple of months. And then there's a long poem towards the end of the book that took me over a decade to write. I would write it and get frustrated with it and not look at it for a long time and then come back to it. And eventually I found the place where I think it needs to be. So the process is about practice and work and slowly narrowing towards that sense of what the poem or the piece wants to do. Yeah.
You're the youngest poet I know.
Yeah.
Are we losing?
poetry getting lost on the kids that don't go to college?
Mm.
I've never, ever knew any poet that didn't learn about it in college.
That's a fabulous question, and I think going back to talking about ideas of beauty, I think it's something we really need to consider. There's been such a push in K-12 education for STEM access, for access to these tools that are primarily we think of as economical or efficiency tools, and they can be beautiful in their way. But I think in doing that, we have imbalanced ourselves, and we have many young people who would love access to the kind of beauty that poetry allows, that the arts allow. People who, for one reason or another, might not end up in college, or who might not understand that college is also a place where that is practiced.
Yeah.
And so I do think we have an imbalance, absolutely. And that if you go to most college campuses, you'll find a flourishing literary scene. I have students who are in head over heels, they're excited, they're creating their literary magazine, they're having poetry nights on campus, they are engaged and excited. But I do think part of that is they didn't have that often in high school, and that was lacking. And now they see it and they're like, whoa, this is also something in the world. And of course it depends on the school, and it depends on where, but I see that in the wider world for sure, yeah.
So I have a handful of questions. You can
Yeah.
cut me off whenever. And one of them's a follow-up to a question you were asked about poetry versus lyrics and things like that. So you wrote the poems that you read, and you have that cadence in your head.
Mm-hmm.
If I got up there and chose how I read it, would that be like nails on a chalkboard to you?
No, not at all.
Does it, to you, maybe not to me, a trained ear, but like to you, a trained ear, does that dramatically shift the meaning and weight of the poem, or?
No, I do talk with my students about how to read. Mostly I tell them, just slow down. But I do talk with them about that, but I don't think so. It doesn't, the poem for me exists on the page as well as when I read it. And some poets are much more, so if we want to talk about slam poetry, that's much more poetry that exists in the air between us, right? That's interpreted each time, and so the performance matters a lot. For me, it's part of it, but it's definitely not the whole thing. And I'm always interested to see how people do interpret it. And I tend to think, too, a lot of what the line does is force you to read it a particular way. So prose, you can vary a lot in how you might read it. In poetry, because of the line, you're forced to stop, go back to the next side of the page and start again. You might have big jumps of white space. It might look really silly and strange, like a poem like this with lots of dropped lines and white space. And all of that is a tool for the reading as well. It changes the reading. And so for me, form and the way I read it are really closely linked. So you can read as many as you want, Zach. It won't bother me.
Do you ever go back to Montana, other than visiting?
No. We like it where we are quite a bit, and I think I love a lot about Montana, but I also think that every time I go back, I'm reminded of many of the reasons I left, and those things are things I'm speaking to and against and challenging and trying to reckon with myself, and I find it easier to do that from a distance, to be able to observe it and to think about it in memory and to think about it not when I'm wrapped up in it.
That distance,
Mm-hmm.
is it more of a cultural distance or environmental distance?
Both. I would say, though, it's more of I think it's a cultural distance is important. So I teach a class called Darkness on the Edge of Town, Rural America and Contemporary Literature. Yeah, it's great. We were just talking about this morning, my students and I, about the distinct cultures that are present in rural areas, and the ways that those are wrongly mythologized, both for good and for ill, and the ways that those cultures are healthy in some respects and very unhealthy in others, and unsustainable in many ways. Yeah, yes. And so it's definitely a cultural distance, for sure. But I also really like being this close to the coast. And, I mean, I love where we are geographically.
I feel like that when I go back to Michigan.
Yeah.
I have a chance to take a class, because I moved to Newport. There's a class over there called Learning How to Read Poetry.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, man, really? But I think you've talked me into taking it.
Oh, good.
I took a class from this teacher, and I didn't particularly like his way of teaching, but I'm willing to throw that aside in order to see what he has to say about poetry, because the other class wasn't about poetry.
Yeah. No, I do think that there's, and just like anything, there are, as you practice, you get better, right? As you listen to jazz, it might sound sort of strange at first, but as you start to listen, you start to understand something about it. And you think, oh, wait a minute, this reminds me of this, or this is kind of how they're doing that. And the same with poetry. As you practice and as you read, you start to get better. And it always helps to have a guide, someone to help you into that process.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, you've convinced me.
I have another question. I don't know how to exactly formulate it, so I'm just going to toss it up and see what you do with it. So one thing I'm fascinated by is the analyzation of the Western myth, right?
Yeah.
Western films and Western story. Rick Slotkin's one of my heroes. So your talk is the necessity of beauty, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what about it? I feel like also you could talk about the necessity of the ugly in terms of fueling great works of poetry, great works of literature, great works of things we can talk about almost as equally as beauty. See the necessity of beauty, but it seems like conflict drives a lot of things, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I don't know what your take is on
Right.
the also necessity
The
of
sweet and sweet without the bitter.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, I'll hit the Westerns and see if I can talk my way into the second part of that. And maybe not, I don't know. So I do think, I watched a lot of Westerns growing up, and that mythology was absolutely a part of the place I was raised. Those archetypes and those stereotypes in some instances were traded actively among us. And if you watch any pop country music video, you will see the same. If you watch any truck commercial during the Super Bowl, you will see the same. These are all participating in those myths, right? And there's some power in those mythologies, but they get a lot of things wrong. And one of the things they get wrong is the primacy of the individual versus the community, right? If you look at the history of the West, it's a history of failure. The place I was born was one of the last places to be homesteaded. So it was passed over. People came to places like Oregon because it's way better soil here, right? Like they came here. They didn't want that.
And they ran out of land here.
Yeah, and they ran out of land here. So railroad companies started opening up poorer lands. And people like Joseph Campbell started making lots of money publishing his manual for agriculture for the dry lands countries. So you had all this sort of hucksterism going on, and you had people who were desperate and who were trying to participate in the same mythology, right? And so they come into many of these places, and it's the same homesteader story we've told ourselves, that homesteaders came, they stayed, and they built this community, this country, right? But they didn't. In the area I'm from, well over 80% of them failed. They left. They had a few years. They all came. So the Enlarged Homestead Act is in 1909. So you could get up to 320 acres of Montana. They started coming in droves in 1910, 11, 12. And then what happened is you had 13, 14, and 15 are all really wet years. And by wet, I mean like 20 inches of rain. So it's not that much, but it was enough for there. And then 16, it goes back to about normal. And then 17, 18, and 19 are drought years. And then in 1902, you have the price of grain drops after World War I. And you have literally hundreds of thousands of people leaving this country. And you have them leaving in the worst possible way. You have a refugee crisis. Cities in Washington State especially were trying to figure out how to deal with this refugee crisis because many people were coming west. They'd heard about apple picking and other things like that. Some historians call it one of the largest overlooked mass migrations in American history because so many came in after the 1910 census and left before the 1920 census. And so you have tremendous human suffering occurring, and we still tell the story of homesteading. And the community I grew up in, we still tell that story as if it worked, as if it was true. And it didn't, not at all. And it's in human memory. It's in my grandparents' memory, right? And it didn't work. And so that's one of the myths the Western gets wrong. Community matters way more than the primacy of the individual. The other myth, of course, and maybe this gets to the second part of the question, is the question of violence. In Westerns, violence almost always solves something, right? And at least growing up, violence almost never solved anything that I saw. And it often just leads to more violence, right? And there's this wonderful moment in the end of No Country for Old Men, which I always think of as a hopeful movie. Mostly because it destroys these old Western myths, right? But there's a moment after Anton Chigurh has killed everybody, right? He's just killed Llewellyn Moss's widow, basically for no reason, just 'cause. And he's just killed her. He's leaving the house, and he gets T-boned at an intersection, right? And he stumbles out of the car, and there's these two little boys there, and they're looking at him, and his leg has been injured so bad that his bone is sticking out of his leg, right? And then one little boy says, "Look at that effing bone." And like, that's violence, right? Even the devil himself is wrought up in violence. He can't control it. And it seems for the whole movie like he can, like he's in weird control of everything, but he's not. Even he isn't in control. So maybe, I don't know if that answers some of that. Zach?
How about loss? Loss as an inspiration for poetry.
Yeah. Oh, okay, maybe that gets to the last part of Zach's too. I do think, when I talk about the necessity of beauty, I think I am assuming already that we will lose things. And that beauty isn't a corrective, but it's necessary to understand those losses, how to move not beyond them, but with them, because I think we carry them for all our entire lives. I don't think they ever go away. We only learn to walk around with them. And I think great art both pays attention to that beauty, but also doesn't move away from the darkness and the loss that accompany all our lives in one form or another.
With the aging population of the baby boomers and death imminent on the horizon, has there ever been a study of the best eulogies ever written in the poetry manner?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so eulogies as poetry and ones that are especially strong. So the one I love is W.H. Auden's Elegy for Keats on his death. It's a beautiful, beautiful, sad poem. There's a line, he says, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry." And so there's that sense of hurt being the place that his poetry began. Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful poetic ode to both the man, but also to poetry itself, what he created. I'm kind of not sure about some of the others. Some other elegies that mourn a particular person. Of course, I mean, Whitman's "When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed" is a very powerful elegy for Lincoln. Any other thoughts, questions? Well, thank you all for your time and your attention.
Joe, we're going to send you home with a bottle of our sponsors, Pinot Noir. It's a good thing we're neighbors. I'll know when you crack that open. Yeah, so thank you very much for coming today. And thank you all for coming today to City Club. We'll see you next month. It won't be our regularly scheduled speaker, but we'll be back at our regularly scheduled place, and we'll get a filler speaker in for you, someone well worth it. And we'll see you next month. And don't forget, Joe's got some books in the back, and either Joe or I will sign those for you if you want. So pick a book up on the way out, and we'll see you later. Thank you. Thank you.